Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the seminar Critical Collapsology with instructor Richard Hames. Collapsology has been one of the most strikingly underthought areas of the social sciences, conceptually surrounded by the problem of the indeterminate totality, as well as the hackneyed quality of invocations of the apocalypse. The practice of studying social disintegration remained fragmentary and ad hoc. We still need new critical approaches to this canon and its implications as participants in a society whose future is highly uncertain and whose historical condition of possibility was itself the destruction of other societies. What do we owe future societies when we consider the prospect of collapse? What do we owe past societies? In this seminar, we will explore the field of collapsology and what it means for us. Crucially, this will not be taken as two separate questions, but as a single field of concern. Can we embed what it means for us into our accounts of how collapse actually occurs, integrating the normative and descriptive layers of theory? The careful consideration of collapse is of special importance to anyone who wishes to work with projects that operate over spans of time that exceeds a few decades. Anyone with a radical political project, for instance, must contend with the possibility of a rapid period of transformation that makes the project not only more operationally challenging, but potentially conceptually incoherent. Yet noticing the possibility of our own obsolescence, short of our outright extinction, also opens a rich philosophical terrain. What does it mean to have values that are once historically contingent and claim their universality to be unrealized? What kind of medium is history itself, and how does it resist us? This question is at once densely theoretical and eminently practical, demanding analysis of key questions of ethics, in ethics, and metaethics, but also the challenge of designing new institutions that might carry forward revised goals or at least encase them sufficiently so they can be transported to our descendants. In this first session, we'll be having an introduction to the notion of traditional collapsology. In this introductory lecture, we will discuss some major theories for why societies fall apart, which form much of the basis for current ideas about collapse. These are focused on moral, environmental, demographic, and energetic reasons. We will introduce the philosophical problem of the indeterminate totality, as well as the way a discipline of collapsology has functioned on the outside of more conventional social sciences. About our instructor, Richard Hames is a political theorist and journalist. He is the co-author of Post-Internet Far Right and The Rise of Ecofascism, Climate Change and the Far Right. And he's also an editor of Crude Futures. He is a host of Novara FM and its series producer. Before all that, he was a composer and founder of contemporary music group Ensemble XY. He is currently working on a book project on collapse. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yuval, and thank you to all of you for coming. Hello, I hope you can all hear me, see me, and so on. I've got a microphone plugged in. I might have to unplug it at some point if my computer runs a bit low on energy. But it's lovely to see you all, and it's very exciting to be able to share this project, which has been and still is very much in the making. This has been a thing that I've been thinking about since about 2019. At the moment of the complete disintegration, the complete decline of a collection of political projects that I cared a great deal about. You may be familiar with Corbynism in the UK, which was a sort of attempt to make a sort of left social democratic project in the UK. You'll be, I'm assuming, familiar with Bernie Sanders in the US. And since 2019, I've been trying to take this argument that was often made on the left, which is that without the end of capitalism, there is no end to the possibility of climate change. There is no possibility to solving climate change. And then it seems like capitalism will carry on. I think we can all probably agree with that for the time being. And therefore, I wanted to take seriously this prospect that was being continuously invoked in the left discourse of 2019 and then 2020 of the end of the world. What does it seriously mean for us? And crucially, I think, what it seriously means for us might be that it renders, as was talked about in that introduction just there, the possibility that our projects themselves no longer make sense. Right? I'm going to be talking over the course of these 4 lectures about, or building up to what I describe as critical collapsology. So it's an approach to the field of collapsology, the field of collapse studies. And I should say that people normally refer to as collapse studies, but I think collapsology is a perfectly good, usable name, so I'm going to use it. Building up to a new approach I call critical collapsology. And then in the second half of this seminar, which takes place in May, which is a separate course at the New Centre, we're going to be thinking about those more sort of political implications of collapse. First of all, how do we arrive at our current moment of seeming collapse risk? What does that mean for us? What does it mean for the political project of a radical universalism, whether or not you regard that as a project of the left? And then how can we concretely or practically design forms of institution that can weather the kinds of disaster, the kinds of turbulence that history seems to be determined to throw at our societies, even as we develop societies that are, in many respects, very good at weathering forms of crisis. In fact, that might even be one of their defining features. They might even be uniquely capable of weathering crisis. There's an argument to be made, and I'll be making it a bit later, that capitalism is a system that is uniquely capable of responding to crises because it metabolizes crisis into further value production, right? And that's a thing that it doesn't share with any of the previous forms of society that have collapsed. And so I'm going to be talking about that over the course of the next 8 lectures. 4 of them will happen now, 4 of them will happen in May. But let's begin. And the plan for this lecture, I should say, is to sort of run down for the first 45 minutes or thereabouts what I describe as sort of the problem of collapse. Like, what does it actually mean to encounter collapse? Philosophically, practically, emotionally, and so on. What kinds of responses can we make? And how do those responses appear to us out of the immense jumble of information that we're always presented with in the modern world? We'll then take a bit short break. And in that break, I'm going to get you to think about 5 minutes about what the problem of collapse is for you. Like, do you have a problem of collapse? Do you have an imaginary that extends into a world that is radically different from this one? If so, what does that mean? What does it mean practically, concretely for you? And then the second half of this last session, I'm going to be talking through a collection of theories of collapse that emerged, first of all, a very, very, very long time ago in the 14th century. And then over the course of, or indeed perhaps even earlier, if you count one of the examples that I'm going to talk about. And then I'm going to be talking about how those sort of come into the present. You will note that many of the theories you talk about today don't seem very rigorous, don't seem very robust. I assure you there are better theories. However, today we're not talking about those theories. We're talking about those theories next week when we talk about recent advances in existential risk. Existential risk is a field of concern that is about moments of at which all of humanity is threatened. So everyone dies. Right? That's the existential quality of it. So we're going to be talking about those more recent advances in the ways in which we understand collapse in the following lecture. But for today, we'll talk about traditional collapsology. And then I should say in the third session, we'll be talking about what I call applied collapsology. Applied collapsology is this notion that the destruction of societies is often not a sort of tragic procession, as it is often understood in, for example, the work of Edward Gibbon, or even in Spengler, or someone like that, Oswald Spengler. But in fact, an induced condition, a thing that people deliberately do to each other. Societies are deliberately broken apart. And I'll be looking at various instances of that. Its development out of the field of counterinsurgency. And in the fourth session, I'll be trying to construct this thing that I'm kind of moving towards, which is critical collapsology, which tries to take those advances in the more sort of scientific or rigorous study of collapse, but then critique them by understanding that the ways in which we try and make our societies keep functioning often seems to entail the destruction of societies elsewhere, right? And so it's this dynamic and this sort of push and pull between creation and destruction. So without further ado, traditional collapsology. I also want to say thank you to Bo Briesvech, who's the person I'm working on this book project with. As I say, this is still very much a sort of work in progress. So if you have critiques of it, if you have things you want to update me on, if you have things that you think I've got wrong, please do say. You can contact me via email. Obviously, you can talk to me in the Discord. You can chat in the Zoom, although I probably won't be able to respond to that as I go along because that'd be kind of confusing. But I will come back to those comments at a certain point. We're also writing a Substack. It's crudefutures.substack.com. It's a sort of not very regular at the moment, but it'll become more regular once I finish the course. Updates on our collapse thinking, on our ways of understanding collapse. Collapsology is a necessarily vast field. That's one of the problems that I call the indeterminate totality. We'll come back to that. But it necessarily contains vast amounts of information, right? In some ways, it's an attempt to carry out one of the main historical projects that one could carry out, the question of why does things fall apart? And that necessarily entails vast numbers of dimensions. So if you have, and I imagine you do, some sort of like specialism or some sort of knowledge that you think could contribute to a project, such a project, then I very much welcome that in all the things I listed a moment ago. Yuval and I were talking just before the session began about the possibility of his work in innovation or the philosophy of technoscience and how that might contribute. I'm sure there are many, I'm sure all of you have something to contribute to this project. So first of all, collapsology is the study of the severe decomposition of social structure. That's my initial prompt for thinking about what it is that we are trying to study here. If there is a unity to this field, that is principally the unity that it composes. This will be problematized, come back to many times over and over and over, but I think that's basically the kind of thing that we're trying to do here. So before I get to the question of why things collapse, we should think about the sort of philosophical quandary of it, or about the kind of the immediacy of the problem for us. Why is collapse a problem for us? And I think the first overwhelming character of it is that we always feel like we are scrabbling to catch up to a thing that is already in motion. So that the principal problem of collapse is that it's already seen upon us. Although there have been, since the Second World War, pretty substantial secular increases, so long tendencies of increase, in some very key measures, which I think are pretty good, things like democratic participation, what's called the Human Development Index, which is a synthesis of 3 different measures: lifespan, years of education, and income. Income, of course, more problematic, more complicated, but I think still mostly a good in some very clear way. Clearly, infant mortality, clearly lifespan, both unproblematically good things. Although there have been these long-term tendencies to increase, in the last decade, we have seen them falter. Democratic participation has been falling. Not only the number of people who vote in elections, but also the number of people who have the capacity to take control of their own life in a meaningful way. Climate change has been escalating. You might be familiar with the work of James Hansen, who is not one of the IPCC sort of central figures, but is a very respectable climate scientist whose work says that in the last 5 or 6 years, as opposed to the still going up, we've actually now hit a point where the temperature increase globally is accelerating. That is a very serious issue to think about. And the other things happened since 2019, which is when as I mentioned earlier, first started to think about this, has been the development of artificial intelligence. This, you will note, is a very heterogeneous set of things, right? It's not as if there is one single point of collapse, but they are all tendencies. And crucially, these different tendencies are becoming more and more integrated. So it's not just that we think about energy use, it's not just thinking about artificial intelligence, it's not just thinking about climate change, it's not just we think about biodiversity loss, it's not just we think about, although there are these distinct tendencies and they can be taken analytically distinctively, I think, nevertheless, they are increasingly integrating themselves. One very clear example of this is that artificial intelligence, I think about a year ago, it became basically impossible for anyone who wasn't a major tech company to find an energy contract in the US. So they weren't able to purchase energy or energy futures contracts, because they had all been bought up by people who were trying to train large language models. And so climate change, on the one hand, this problem of energy production and its externalities, and on the other hand, artificial intelligence meet as a single point. You could also think about democratic participation as being interlinked into that dynamic. If you are no longer a useful worker because artificial intelligence has taken your job, then what is the point of elites thinking about you? So democratic participation has a sort of worrying drop off at that point. So these are not distinct things. They are integrated tendencies that we can think about together. There may well be positive ways in which they interact. Certainly, there have been in the last week a couple of developments that of AI and their use in medical research. If that continues, if that turns out to be the case, it may well be the case that it becomes easier to develop medicines, it becomes easier to develop vaccines and so on, all of which would mean that perhaps things like the infant mortality and so on would decrease. So we have an unpredictable integration. This is the field of accelerationism, right? This is the thing that accelerationism, which was a field of discourse, field of interest, that had its sort of high points in 2018, I think, whereabouts on sort of predicted that there was going to be these kind of waves of acceleration throughout history, throughout modernity as a sort of process. And it is crucial, I think, that we think about it as a process. What this means, what these tendencies together mean, is that global space is becoming more densely stitched together, which produces simultaneously greater interconnectedness, forms of mass homogeneity, and at the same time heterogeneity, so the production of difference over large spans, and crucially the production of disparity as well. And as we go through our various theories, both today and next week, you will see that the production of disparity, unequal access to wealth, unequal access to income, unequal access to goods, to services, to food, right? Very basically, those are the things that produce forms of collapse, both in the more gestural language of the theories we'll encounter today, and also the more scientifically sort of rooted and datafied things we will talk about next week. Polycrisis is one way of thinking about this field. And I want to suggest that although polycrisis, I think, is a problematic term, although not a totally useless one, and we'll get into in the fourth seminar, this debate between Adam Tooze and a collection of sort of Marxists about this question of polycrisis, about whether or not it's the right frame, about whether or not there is in fact one singular unified crisis, which has multiple expressions, or there are multiple sort of different things inside the social field. This has moved, polycrisis, has moved from being merely a way of describing our world to actually a way in which many of our most important political actors act in the world. We might describe this as a kind of chaoplexic governance. So the inducement of complexity, the inducement of crisis, certainly if you read the news, right? Like the last 5 weeks of a sort of endless succession of very radical changes. To, for example, the American government. As you can tell, I'm not American, so I'm not going to be focusing on that entirely. But I think it is an important sort of moment for our present. This mode of this form of polycrisis has become a kind of thing that one can do deliberately in order to accelerate and govern through that mode of polycrisis. The sheer, endless slew of things that that are being kind of changed at the moment, government departments that are being cut and so on, means that your opponents are forced to respond faster than they can actually respond, right? And this is a technique of governance in and of itself. There is also the problem of the emerging planetary computational system. So Benjamin Bratton, who I think is a theorist we should think about a fair bit over the course of the next 4 weeks, likes to point out, and I think he's correct, that the epistemological accomplishment of what we think of as climate change is a sort of a consequence of a global computing architecture. The capacity to measure, to integrate, to structure forms of data about the climate that allows us to see these relatively slow incremental changes, these fluctuations in global temperatures. This is absolutely true. We have now entered a new phase, right, in which forms of these kind of computational governance systems, computational measuring systems have become governance systems. That's been gradually happening. It's not like some sort of new thing, but I think it's worth thinking about as a problem of collapse now. Here are some drivers of collapse risk. So you might think, okay, you're thinking too much about climate change, and you actually need to think about something else. But I want to assure you that I'm not, and that in fact, there are many, many other things that we should think about simultaneously. And it's exactly this kind of problem of integration, exactly this kind of problem of diversity that attends that makes the problem of collapse so sort of visceral, but also so complex to deal with. And it's exactly why I'm saying, I hope optimistically, that you will all have something to contribute to this, practically and intellectually. If people are not already sold on climate change, I want to give you one fact as a driver of collapse risk, is that a very large portion of the world's population, about a third, lives in environments that have a mean annual global temperature of 27 degrees. That's the tropics, it's the subtropics. So the country that is most kind of obviously things to mind is India. Almost no one in the whole world, about 800,000 people total, lives in temperatures of 29 degrees. Those are areas inside the Sahara, right? Deep inside the Sahara. Almost no one lives there. The difference between those two is 2 degrees, right? So if you increase global mean annual temperatures by 2 degrees, you move from a situation where billions of people can live in that environment to almost no one living in that environment. There are ways of mitigating this. There are ways of doing things like air conditioning and so on. That is not possible in the time period. And of course, that produces its own kinds of externalities. So there is a very serious problem of what we call a global tipping point emerging here. And that means that those people will have to move, right? Move or die, right? You can imagine the kinds of geopolitical instability. You can imagine the kinds of problems that trying to move 1 billion people out of the Indian subcontinent would produce, right? These are very serious issues. Even if you think about them not happening in the sort of the Hansonian time frame, which is over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, but over the next 20 years, 30 years, these are still massive problems. And this produces what I might think of as a feedback loop between uninhabitable spaces, migration, and increased authoritarianism. I think it was mentioned in the introduction. My second book rather, was on what I call ecofascism. The conclusion of that was that ecofascism is not real, but there are other forms of problems that we should think about instead. This is one of those problems. Pandemics are a very clear driver of collapse risk. If you look at the Human Development Index, it's basically gone up continuously since the Second World War. People have been living longer, fewer children have been dying in childbirth. Fantastic. There is a big dip in the COVID pandemic. We have now gone back to a point above 2019, but it took much, much longer. Future pandemics may not be so in some ways generous, despite all the destruction of the COVID-19 pandemic. Civil war and rising authoritarianism, civil conflicts rather, and rising authoritarianism. I think in some ways too much has been said about polarization for it to be clear, right? It's become a kind of a very generic kind of field of discourse. There is definitely a decrease in belief in democracy. And then we get to the problem of artificial intelligence. Mass superfluousness. You are all, I'm guessing, knowledge workers. I am a knowledge worker. Right? Like, can someone teach this seminar in, could an AI teach this seminar in 3 years, in 4 years, in 5 years? Very possibly, right? That's not an impossibility. Therefore, you get the problem of mass superfluousness. And the gradual displacement of humans in what's called a slow takeoff scenario, or a gradual displacement of humans from being the central vectors of decision-making in the world to our automated systems that surround us. There are ways of conceptually unifying these things. So we live in an organizational niche. We live in an environmental niche that is defined by relative stability in the kinds of climates we expect, or in the kinds of weather patterns we expect. In some ways, AI is a kind of artificial environmental change, right? It's like climate change, but for the technological environment, in which the technological environment rapidly changes, rapidly takes off, moves and shifts in unpredictable ways that we can't adapt to in sufficient time. We will talk about this slow takeover of society. We'll talk about the slow takeover of society and the paper that I've put in the reading for next week, which I think is a very interesting paper and very telling in the kinds of ways it understands society. And then there is, of course, the question of geopolitical conflict. So not just conflict inside societies, but between them. And the paradigm that I think people might be familiar with, which is the new Cold War, this possibility that China and America are now in the same relationship that America and the Soviet Union were for much of the 20th century. And that spins off in all directions, right? There's no way of containing that. There's no way of saying, okay, this is now the risk dampened, right? There is a fundamental kind of conflict there that I think people have imagined. I am not saying all these are real. I'm saying these are all worth considering. So I've talked about polycrisis already. We'll come back to that in session 4. But I want to suggest that instead of polycrisis, we have another way of thinking about this. And this comes from R. Scott Bakker, who was actually talking about the problem of human cognitive enhancement. So talking about the ways in which we might update our brains and then try and understand the world. And he says, well, once you updated your brain, the kinds of conceptual architecture that you use to understand the world fall apart, right? You can no longer use the same conceptual tools for the same conceptual job. And I want to suggest something similar happens with the possibility of collapse. Once we enter a collapse, and I should say, I don't think this is very likely in the next few years, right? But like once you enter a collapse scenario, your whole environment is restructured such that your concepts no longer relate to the ground, right? There's no longer a possibility of making the tools do the right kinds of jobs that you're thinking of, or you want them to do for you. And so this is what he describes as crash space. The reliability of our heuristic cues utterly depends on the stability of systems involved. Anytime our heuristic systems are miscued, we very quickly find ourselves in crash space, a problem-solving domain where our tools seem to fit the description, but cannot seem to do the job done. There's another way of thinking about this, which I think is quite interesting, and I will sort of refer to as a metaphor before a couple of times, which is the very literal space of a crash of an airplane. So as an airplane goes down, right, as it kind of comes down towards the ground, it will be pinging continuously its location to radar systems around it. Will say, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. And that's where, and that way you can track where the airplane is, both sort of up and down, and also in the forward coordinates. As the plane goes below the horizon, with respect to the radar system that it is pointing to, right, it becomes difficult to track. You can't see where the plane is. And if the plane then crashes, you don't know where that object is. And so you have these very wide, and because planes are going fast, very long crash spaces into which the debris of the plane might have been strewn. And so you have these enormous areas. Of course, at sea, this is even more difficult because people don't live at sea. And so there's a very difficult kind of way of finding planes. You may be familiar with some very famous examples of this. The meaning I mean to make of this is that we have concepts, right? We have concepts that track our reality to some extent. And what collapse does, because it destroys our environments through which we understand those concepts and the environmental cognition which we rely on, as those environments change rapidly, we can't predict where the concepts will land. And so collapse is not simply a problem of saying, oh, this will change and that will change and that will change, but also of being genuinely uncertain in some quite deep way about the social future that we enter into from our own vantage points. There is a conceptual problem that I will come back to sort of time again, which is like, could you build the machine? Could you build the machine that would encompass collapse? That would say, okay, we now have a full picture of a collapse. And I think almost by necessity, no. Because the very machines that you would build to encompass it or to understand it are exactly the kinds of things that would be destroyed in the collapse process. And so we have this problem that we're almost looking, to use another metaphor, right, of almost sort of a black hole, right, an event horizon of a kind of historical event beyond which our concepts and our predictions and so on no longer make sense. In this heterogeneity, so we have this enormously heterogeneous list of collapse drivers. We have climate change, geopolitical conflict, AI, and so on and so on and so on. Where are they all coming from? Well, I want to make a sort of anthropological claim about the current moment, which is that what I'm describing as collapse culture, and I'll go on to a moment what I say, I'll go in a moment to say what I mean by that, is that we have these different kinds of sources, and the sources are very heterogeneous. So we have something that we might describe as reactionary civilizationism. You may be familiar with this from movements to the far right, who say the problem is we're not having enough white babies, right? And so it becomes a matter of reproducing a particular racial group. But there are also variants of this that we're not reproducing the right kinds of cultural mores, the right kinds of cultural values, the right kinds of institutional structure, and so on. Those all get grouped together in reactionary civilizationism. Other people have thoughts about institutions as well. It's not just a reactionary thing, obviously. And then you get a source of people, things like environmentalism. So environmentalism clearly fixates, or not fixates, but like focuses mostly on climate change as a problem. The extrapolations there are towards this kind of acceleration of global temperatures, but also biodiversity loss, also a whole collection of other things. People might be familiar with the 9 different dimensions of planetary limits, right? And the way in which we crossed, I think 7 of them now. And so there is a whole collection of other ideas about how collapse happens from there. The most, in some ways, strident of these is what the discourse known as deep adaptation, which predicts a relatively near-term collapse and attempts to make various forms of adjustments in relation to that, and to think about value in a more sort of localized way. We will talk about deep adaptation a bit later. Then there is existential risk discourse. As I mentioned a few times, existential risk discourse is basically an academic discipline, but it has sort of various policy orientations as well. So it's trying to influence governments, trying to make institutions that can respond to these kind of things. And it has a very heterogeneous collection of risks, not all of which are collapse risks. So it's not all that they are what I think of as M risks. Mostly they are what X risks. So X risk is a scenario in which everyone dies. To put it very bluntly, it's a total wipeout of humanity. There are gradations inside that, but I don't think we have time to go through them. And that's contrasted in existential risk studies with S risks. So S risks are suffering risks. They are forms of future in which not everyone dies, but everyone's life is locked into a path of unremediated suffering, or sort of awful suffering, just forever and ever and ever. So the classic example of this is like the Matrix, right, where people are still alive, but they are embedded in this simulacrum and then used as sort of batteries for a future. You can also think about something like what is called global North Korea, right? So you have just like massive suffering on an enormous scale, totalitarian governments. Everyone's still alive, or lots of people are still alive, but life is sort of fundamentally suffering. And what I want to do in thinking about collapse, which is not, again, an existential risk, because not everyone dies in collapses, but an M risk, a meaningfulness risk, the capacity of us to make our own projects, our own lives meaningful over sufficient periods of time to regard them as things worth having, right? So it's not exactly a question of physical suffering, but a kind of more an emotional suffering or a cognitive suffering or a difficulty or struggle to make meaning. Existential risk discourse also contains things like asteroids, right? Will an asteroid hit the Earth? You may be seen in the last week, there's been one asteroid that went from like a 1.5% chance of hitting us to like a 3.1% chance of hitting us, which means that by the time in 2032, I think it is, maybe someone can correct me there, it's in a long time. This pace of acceleration in the probability is obviously not sustainable. That would mean that by the time it hit us, it would be have a 12,000% chance of hitting us, which I don't think is actually mathematically possible, although I'm not a mathematician. So this is the kind of risk. They're also talking about supervolcanoes, blah, blah, lots of different things. And then there's what I might think of as polycrisis management extrapolations. Oh, sorry, also in the existential risk basket, nuclear war. Polycrisis risk management extrapolations. So although polycrisis is not directly concerned with collapse, it is concerned with things that are the sort of preludes to collapse. What would it be in the classic example, I think, from when the term first became widely used, which was when Russia invaded Ukraine, right? So you have the problem of energy resources, you have the problem of a war, you have the problem of a whole bunch of different other things. Right? What would it be if this kind of just interminably carried on and we entered into a sort of a collapse spiral? What someone like Laurie Laban calls a doom loop, and we'll get some of his work next week. My point here is simply that these are strange bedfellows, right? These are not coherent. This is not one group of people. It's not a coherent group of people. Jem Benzel, who is the main writer in Deep Adaptation, clearly would not agree with like Elon Musk, who's become a very clear figure in both reactionary civilizationism and also an existential risk discourse. They would neither of them would agree with like, Eliezer Yudkowsky. Actually, Elon Musk might agree with Yudkowsky, but Yudkowsky is a main sort of AI risk proponent. There are lots of fields of risk. There's a lot of these things. And what this means is that the collapse culture that we've inherited has these features. It has an undetermined anxiety about the limitless worsening of conditions. Very few people, apart from, say, Mark Andreessen, who's another sort of a AI is good person, very few people are not in this field are not thinking about the limitless worsening conditions, right? That is the general tendency, but they all think it will happen in different ways. Because of the heterogeneity of the kinds of things one must address, the kinds of ideas one must talk through, the kind of data one must gather. There is ad hoc extrapolation towards catastrophe. So instead of saying we have this one clear path, all the different tendencies I've been talking about, as they intermingle, seem to confound each other, make each other worse. That means that we extrapolate towards catastrophe. We're also seeing, I think, increasingly stark and contrasting claims about what isn't possible. So it is possible, we can just do this. We can just go to Mars. We can just destroy all the computers. We can just, or we can't, we're sort of locked in. We can't change the energy system. We can't change biodiversity loss, right? We have very stark contrasting claims. I think that's a product of a certain kind of heterogeneity that we'll try and sort of think through and ultimately, I think, try and overcome. The sociological grounding of these is what I might describe as the shift from a postmodern culture to a network culture. So the claims about postmodern culture, which are many and varied, one of them is about atomization, right? So what we also call as neoliberalism, or the neoliberal atomization of society. I recommend Wendy Brown's really good book on this, Undoing the Demos. Because culture was atomized, because many of the central meaning-making institutions and power-wielding institutions in societies, unions, churches, clubs, and so on, were dismantled systematically for about 30 years. There was a loss of a sense of powerlessness, but also a loss of sense of society as a coherent whole. What the network culture that we are now in, right? We're on the internet. You and I don't know each other in person, but we are talking in this kind of dense network of the news center. Because that network culture supplanted postmodernism, but inherited some of its skepticism about historical narratives, we have extremely contrasting senses of possibility and impossibility. You can just do things in the sort of the mantra of the tech bro, or like actually you are dominated by the structural. You are dominated by the long history of 400 years of transatlantic colonialism and so on, right? You get these very contrasting claims. And these are both responses, I think, to a similar feeling of the impending end of history, the impending end of coherent historical time. On the one hand, now you can just do things. We are free of history. On the other hand, we are dominated by history, and that is what is causing the end of time. And you will see in the people we talk about today and also next week that both of them integrate these kinds of notes of structural forcing with moments of particular decision-making. And the question of the relationship between the two is one of the things that centrally animates the field of claims. So we have a kind of thing like this, right? I don't expect anyone to sort of grok this diagram, right? That's the kind of the point of it. It's supposed to be ungrokkable. It's supposed to be in some ways impossible to read. This is the central plane here is what's called the crisis diagram, right? It's a way of understanding the interlinkedness. I think this particular one might come from Thomas Homer Dixon. Maybe it comes from like some German institute. I can't remember the exact source, but this is sort of an artwork by a friend of mine called Matthias. And there is this feeling of an overwhelm, right? So there are these sort of planes in the center. There is this nebulous arrow. What does it mean? What is being conjured here? There are these like systemic foundations of the now, non-compensable risks, scientific progress, the generation of wealth, vast abstractions that seem to push up through the middle of this thing, this kind of plane of historical time, into these very particular, almost epiphenomenal manifestations, end core, the neo-feudalist economy, friendshoring, the lab leak theory, and so on, right? These and exactly how to unify these or to understand them as a single coherent whole, I think is the challenge of collapsology in the present moment. So this is the thing. It might remind you as well of this amazing diagram that was put about by, I think this was an attempt by the counterintelligence forces in Afghanistan, principally the Americans, while they were during the war on terror, to describe in a single diagram the entire dynamics of the Afghan war. Thanks, I guess, what to make of it. It's not clear that in this case or in this case anything is actually clarified, right? And I think so. This is the real condition that we're in, right? It's not clear what's going on. Nevertheless, right, it remains not a kind of field that we can just retreat from. There is a political utility to the concept of collapse. We have to have a concept of collapse because if not, someone else will have one for us. I think it's necessarily contested. People might be familiar with the notion of an essentially contested concept. Something like democracy. It's a good example, maybe the central example. Because in order to decide what democracy is, you would need to have a process for deciding how to decide. And then once you need a process for deciding how to decide, you also need a process for deciding that process. And so on and so on and so on. And so it's not really a concept that can just be given a clean, easy definition. You have to sort of establish it. And that's why I'm emphasizing to talk sort of in a relatively loose philosophical language, what I might describe as sort of the thrownness of the problem of collapse. Right, we appear to be in the middle of it, rather than being able to say, step back and say, okay, well, this is how it will go in the future from a position of relative safety. So to designate a collapse is both something to pick something out and to give it ethical stakes. You will see this as well in the theorists we talk about today. There is always an ethical aspect to what they think about collapse. Should collapse happen? Does anyone here think collapse is good? Raise your hands if you think collapse is good. Yep, cool. You got one. Is that a question or a sort of a yes, collapse is good? Okay, I'm gonna assume it's a yeah, Jen Bendel, yes, collapse can be good. Okay, so they're definitely like kind of different positions on this. Lynn, yes, collapse good. Yeah, Jen Bendel, the person I talked about before, deep adaptation. I think it's clear that there are concepts of collapse that we don't agree with. I'm going to venture that some of those concepts very clearly come from the reactionary civilizationism. I don't think that it is necessary to have more white babies. Yeah, 3 edgelords is about the right the number, about 10% edgelords. You don't know what I think either, so maybe I'm taking it to 4. But I think it's important to have a politically useful concept of collapse, because otherwise people will have them for us, right? And so my question, this may not be your question, but my question is, what is useful for the left, right? Positively in framing new trajectories for action, and also defensively. How can collapse be implemented against our enemies, and how can notions of collapse be implemented politically by our enemies? My concrete prediction on this, and you can write this down and come back in 5 years and see if I'm true, if I'm right. My concrete prediction is that in about 5 years, or within the next 5 years, there will be major geoengineering happening by either India, China, or America. India, for the reasons I talked about before, which is that raising temperatures even slightly would be catastrophic for India. America, because they have global interests, and China, because they have A, global interests, and B, are struggling to get off coal, basically. And so simply doing geoengineering, lower the temperature artificially, this might be a much cheaper form of a response to threat of climate change. I think that's very likely. It's very likely. Again, 90%, 5 years. And so we get to a collection of problems or questions we can ask ourselves about collapse. What can we do practically to prevent or outlast collapse, right? That's the most immediate and obvious question. Can we stop this? Apart from our 3 edgelords, everyone else might want to stop collapse. How can we disentangle anxieties that are different from collapse from the fear of collapse? The key example here is something called elite panic. So elite panic is a concept in sociology in which the elites respond to some sort of problem that seems to be brewing, not by trying to address the problem, but by trying to contain it through force, through discipline, law and order, and so on. I don't think it's on the reading list, actually. There is a really good study of Haiti, of the long history of the decline and deprivations of Haiti as a country, that focuses on, I think very compellingly, the problem of elite panic. How did elites respond to the various forms of demands of the population by going into overdrive with various kinds of authoritarian ways? So when we think about collapse, certainly when I think about collapse as like a middle-class British man, like, am I really just worrying about my own loss of social status? Am I really just worrying about the possibility that there is that people in the global south will start to live as I do, or that I will have to lower my conditions and so on? These are all the kinds of problems that we might think are as being produced or like understood in the same kind of way as collapse, or become metabolized as the fear of collapse, even though they actually originate somewhere else. Of course, we could also ask, how can we develop simply a more nuanced picture of possible social changes? That's a very compelling project. It's a very straightforward empirical one. We might also ask, well, how is society sustained in the first place? Things fall apart, but how do they stay together? And this leads us into a whole collection of other kinds of study. We will talk in the fourth seminar on critical collapsology about various kinds of reproduction theory. Much of that work was done by Italian feminists in the 1970s, but there's lots of other things that go on there, pointing out that although the world of work, right, in the traditional Marxist imaginary, though the world of work is very central, there is also, of course, the world of the house, right, and the world of making people. Much of that work is what is called feminized in literature, principally carried out by women, and so on. We can think about those as forms of reproduction. The question is, why would reproduction stop? But this is not to say that society either reproduce or collapse, right? What it is to say is that there may be forms of reproduction, forms of making our society, making it again, that induce their own kind of collapse risk. So very clearly, capitalism is a system that grows, right? I think that's pretty unarguable. As capitalism grows, that's a form of reproduction, or expanded reproduction, or expanding reproduction rather, which itself produces its own kind of risk. And so it's not that the problem is either chaos or stability, but the stability produces chaos, or vice versa. Right? There are different kinds of dynamics here that are more than just a simple spectrum. How should we comport ourselves towards society threatened by collapse? Not only our own. Do we like our own society? Do we want to keep it? But how might we comport ourselves to societies elsewhere and in other places that are threatened by collapse? If you are in the Americas, and I think probably some of you are, right, you almost certainly live in a place where there was a previous society, right, which was collapsed. In many cases, quite deliberately. Some of it was accidental through diseases and so on, but some of it was very deliberate. You are living on a land of genocide. So how do you relate to that? How do we respond to the question of collapse in the past and the ways in which our society has been produced on the corpses of other societies that came before? What do we owe those societies? And perhaps more abstractly, how might we understand history as a general field in light of what we might think of as a new catastrophism? So against the Whiggishness, against the slow kind of liberal narratives of endless progress and so on, how might we understand our place in history in light of that catastrophism, in light of the kinds of dynamics that it produces? Much more personally, this is a question in my life. Should we have children? What kinds of continuity do we expect to bequeath our children? Pete Wolfendale, who is also an instructor at the New Center, whose seminars are great. I recommend whenever you get the chance, go. Thinks this is sort of the central problem of philosophy in some ways. The question of bequeathing an autonomy to someone else, of setting up conditions such that someone else can become autonomous, right? That's the problem of children. If there is not going to be a world coherent and meaningful, stable, comfortable, and so on for our children, should we have them? How can we have a good life? Right? What modes are possible, flourishing are possible in a radically changed world? How can we influence post-collapse culture? I have some ideas about this. Some of them more balmy than others. And we can get onto the balmy ones, I think, at some point. What strategies can we produce when faced with deeply uncertain futures? And to come back to the thing I started at the very beginning of this with, what sense does a radical politics make in a world that faces collapse? I believe in the universality of all humans, and that the ideal political form would be something that expressed that universality and heterogeneity simultaneously. If that's not going to happen, because instead we're going to go into a world of deep uncertainty, of deep fracturedness, of chaos, of violence, then my belief in that is just mere hoping. It is just mere preference stating. And if I want to say my political ideals have a value that is not merely the value of my own personal preferences, but that is a product that you should share, which is something I do want to say, then if the future is not going to turn out that way, what force do my preferences have? right? There is, to go back to sort of philosophical register, Kant has this axiom, right? Ought implies can. If you are compelled to do something, you must actually be able to do it. If we cannot make a society that is equitable, that is universal, that is free, then we are not compelled to. Which is a dangerous thought, right? In terms of the dynamics of radical politics. Okay, so 3 collapsologies: traditional collapsology, more or less comparative sociology; applied collapsology, the deliberate social destruction. This is the painting at the top is from Cole's Progress of Empire, and it's this is destruction. This is the 4th painting, I think. In the middle, we have a British soldier in the counterinsurgency in what was then Malaya, now Malaysia. And this is one of the founding counterinsurgencies in the post-Second World War era. Right, it's one of the places where the British established modes of counterinsurgency, mode of social destruction, destroying trust, and so on, that then are used globally by the Americans and the French in the war in Algiers and so on. Algeria, sorry. The very last one is critical. This is what I'm describing as a sort of reflexive or normative and synthetic collapsology. And this extremely pixelated, I didn't realize it's so pixelated. This extremely pixelated picture is of a 3D model of a Tuvaluan island. So Tuvalu is one of these low-lying island nations that is threatened with complete inundation. They have made 3D models of their entire island such that the nation is preserved as a sort of a form of data, right? I'm not suggesting that as a viable project. I think it's very strange, but I think it's sufficiently sort of mind-bending, strange object to really sort of grind our concepts against. These are my 3 claims, the 3 slides. First of all, traditional collapsology lacks a robust theory of social structure. Right? It does not understand reproduction. But we can fix this with insights from critical social ontology, social reproduction theory, and complex system science to solve the problem. My second claim is the history of social collapse in the 19th century is mostly a history of induced collapse. I've talked about what's called the clearance of the plains, right, which is the genocide of the indigenous people of America by the American armed forces after the Civil War. But it happens much before that, and it continues to this day. We could also talk about what Mike Davis calls the late Victorian Holocausts, which were famines that were either semi-deliberately induced or were completely indifferently responded to by the British administration in India. And this destruction is the dark underbelly of attempts to shore up social order, which often turn into justifications for destruction elsewhere, or exactly where you are. Actually, it doesn't have to be elsewhere. It's often very much in a particular very location. We'll talk about next time A. Dirk Moses, who wrote a book on what's called permanent security. Permanent security is the response of states to threats that says we will deal with this threat once and for all by destroying entirely the enemy that opposes us, right? And that's the logic of genocide. And so I think you can't talk about collapse in its sort of stately forms, in its sort of Roman, Mayan, Chinese, right, without thinking about genocide. What is collapse then? So I think it names a crisis of the hidden distributed agency that stitches societies together. This is a problem for the left because the project of the left presupposes forms of agency that would disintegrate with collapse. Our agent is missing. Our agent falls apart. And there's a broader philosophical version of this, which is the question of how to orient in history, if that is the case. What Adam Tooze accuses the various Marxists in the sort of polycrisis debate of doing is having a sort of a security blanket. And their security blanket is their own theory of history, that we merely exist in a sort of interreg between 2 different, very more or less stable forms of capitalism. He says, no. You have to get rid of that security blanket. There is no guarantee that we are just in some sort of moment of chaos in between 2 moments of stability. There is no guarantee of that at all. There is very likely, very possibly, just a sort of a road into more and more disruption. Disruption is perhaps too strong. So the question of how to orient in history, how to understand ourselves as historical actors who are trying to both make a better society in the future, but also try and bring about some form of restitution for past societies and their destruction. the past suffering that's happened. There is a question of orientation. Hurrah! Let's take a break. I want to give you 5 minutes now to have a think about what your question regarding collapse would be. I've given you a lot of sort of framing. I've given you a lot of sort of like, different notions, different ideas there about how I understand collapse. What I'd like you to do is go get a cup of tea or coffee if you're not me, and have a think. Like, what do you think? What is your question regarding collapse? And then we'll come back and we'll put them on the chat, a brief talk, and then I'll talk about some of the existing theories for traditional collapsology. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you in 5 minutes. Sorry, yes. Hello, welcome back. I'm just going to read out the comment that was made in the chat a while back. This is Parham. It says, chaos can serve as a narrative instrument, and therefore the left could possibly find collapse useful as a means to establish a new order once the current social structures break down. That's a very common thought. I think it's a sort of reasonable first pass. You will find the same everywhere else, right? So everyone else thinks that as well. There's a meme which is basically for the four political quadrants: left, right, authoritarian, libertarian, and there is each character in the middle. Each has one sort of character, and they're all saying in the same speech bubble, "I can't wait for society to fall apart, so I can implement my ideology." Like everyone else thinks that as well, unfortunately. So that you may be right as a matter of sort of fact, but I think it's a common thought across the political spectrum, and I wouldn't be so sure that it would have good outcomes. There are, I will say, good outcomes to the fall of the Roman Empire for some people. So people's diets become more diverse in large areas of Europe. And the reason for this is that you're no longer compelled by the tax collector who comes around to grow the cash crop that he demands that you grow so you can sell it at the market. Instead, you move back towards subsistence. But subsistence, that doesn't mean you grow less. It means you can grow more diverse things because you're feeding yourself directly. And so once you get that kind of state structure, the imperial structure of the Roman Empire removed, then people's lives become more diverse, and certainly their foodstuffs became more diverse, and that leads to increases in health. I would not be so sure about that happening in a 3 or 4 degree hotter world, but we can hope. Does anyone want to go first in terms of like describing how they see this problem of collapse, or what the problem of collapse for them is? You can write it in the chat. You can speak out loud. I don't mind. Yeah, hi, Lynn.
Hi, yeah, thanks for your speech. I mean, for me, this problem is really complex because on one hand, I get a strong feeling that certain social processes and structures, institutions, and social orders in certain countries, or maybe in all countries, to a certain extent, don't work anymore as much as, well, I would like them to. But at the same time, I observe that criticizing them from within does not suffice because, well, capitalism and institutions have integrated so greatly the critique in their own functioning that it doesn't change that much in their order of things. Because critique is actually the most common and the most normative thing which one can do in order to prolong the lives of the same processes. And at the same time, I, of course, also have a lot of doubts in collapse as a total chaos. I mean, on one hand, I'm fascinated with the idea about what could this bring, but also from the historical events which we observed, it doesn't usually bring much except for the new dictatorships or new rigid social structures which are established after the time of chaos has passed. So actually, my speech is rather kind of a doubt of an artist of where to put your energy into, whether you need to criticize the fields from within while continuing their functioning, or try to be a trickster and make certain gestures which could possibly lead to collapse. But of course, this also has an unknown output, and we cannot really be sure if it will have any kind of positive consequences on societies. And I mean, of course, there are also a lot of questions. What are the positive consequences and who labels them as such? So yeah, that's kind of how I see it at the moment.
Great. Yes. Very interesting. Yeah. I don't have anything directly to say in response to that because I want to get through as many as possible, but that's really great. Thank you so much. I'm going to respond to Carsten, who says in the chat, it sounded like there was a broad strokes juxtaposition of growth as continuous capital accumulation versus collapse of social order and ecological systems, which seemed very simplified and not useful to me. There are metabolic interactions, growth that consumes, collapse, decay that fertilizes ground for the new. With that in mind, I'd love to know more about the psychological notion of collapse as a semantic construct. What does it mean to us? Are there contemporary secular eschatologies? How are they different in different cultural hemispheres? Yeah, so I mean, I think I mentioned, I'll go back a bit. So I don't think that there is a sharp distinction between the growth on the one hand and then collapse on the other. I think they are mutually entwined processes. I think I mentioned that here about like the way in which reproduction of society, I think entails forms of collapse and vice versa, right? Maybe I'm not getting quite to what you mean there. But I think that there's there are definitely forms of massive simplification. So if you look at someone like Joseph Tainter's work, there is a I think he's more guilty of doing this exact thing, but we'll come to Tainter next week, where the point I'll be making there is that I think that Tainter's notion of a linear increase in complexity or sort of general increase in complexity is a misunderstanding of the history of technology. And actually there are moments of radical simplification, radical reorganization, and that mean that actually growth reaches certain sort of structures at which it is no longer a certain level at which it is no longer radically complexifying, but in fact re-simplifies the social structure, and this lends things a more sort of stability. Jordan Wilson says, I started to wonder about the driving factors behind expansion and contraction of trends coming in and out of manifestation in the current day as infotainment. Yes, that's very interesting. I guess there is a general dynamic of infotainment, right? There's a general sense in which collapse has become a kind of spectacleized object. I think this relates back to what Parham was saying, which is that collapse could be good, right? This kind of general take. And I think that there is almost a longing for collapse. Maybe this speaks as well to what you were saying, Carsten, about the psychological notion of collapse, right? The fear of collapse. And I think that we should admit, as I think Lynn also pointed to, that there is something, although we don't perhaps think it's necessary or possible or even plausible, there is a sort of an allure to collapse, right? It's a kind of a notion that we suspend out in front of ourselves to drive us harder in the opposite direction, or indeed to sort of toy around with the possibility of our own demise or our own obsolescence. There's something sort of the death drive, I think, in the wish for or the luster for collapse. There are definitely secular eschatologies. Absolutely, yes. I think that, of course, the movement to the left, communism, was a secular eschatology. I think that there are many secular eschatologies in someone like Nick Bostrom's work as well. He wrote a book recently called Deep Utopia, which attempts to work out what it is that you would do once you'd solved all your technical problems. And he's also very much in this sort of field. He was part of the Future Life Institute at the University of Oxford until it was closed down. They're not doing paperwork properly or something. There's also some like big scandal there. I'm not gonna touch that one. But there was a so those kind of sense of utopia and the fear of collapse sort of fit together, I think, really, really importantly. Ultima Generazione 1 says, as a climate activist, I sometimes ask myself, is what I am risking worth it? Should I strive to stop collapse? Is it too late? I'm not sure if I should ethically answer that question. I think it's not too late, but maybe that's just my, I don't want to pressure you to do anything excessively risky. Great, cool. And Senta.
Hey, can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, hi. I do have a question, mostly related to what you stated in the beginning about taking collapsology in a way has something derived from the philosophical reflections which are compounded in this word accelerationism, right? Like some sort of evolution, more specifically, on several of the stratas discussed from accelerationism, right? I also take accelerationism as the main frame of reference for my question, since I notice it's a common currency through TNC students and scholars and such. So considering that, I was thinking about one other pretty popular or mainstream or mainstreamized, I don't know, form of contemporary, more defined, more determinate, which is to say effective forms of accelerationist thought, which is like this idea of post-humanism, which is also brought a lot in the discussion of collapse of extinction. There is this maybe ontological discussion, ontological in the sense of what does give our reality a sense? What does comprise our reality as humans? And usually in a traditional, more rational framework of thought, more transcendental, one could say that that ontological principle is like teleology, right? Like the idea of going from one place to the other, getting to a goal. Rather, I see both in posthumanism and collapsology posited here has derived from accelerationism, has if they share a different point of ontological preference. Instead of teleology, there is this idea of thananthropism, of not taking the idea of thriving or striving human life, but rather assimilating the way in which this can give us different outcomes of thinking quote unquote world without us, since apparently we are still in our minds the most important species in the planet, and in a sense, in an actual existence sense, we are, right? Like we are literally modifying the global temperature. My question based upon this point is, considering that in a sense collapsology and posthumanism has frameworks derived from reflections upon the idea of 21st century extinction or contemporary fields that can derive on extinction, which is to say a difference, for example, the 20th century, where the global threat was not extinction, but rather the atomic bombs. I was thinking, does collapsology, does it look for some sort of philosophical determinacy in the sense of, for example, other thinkers more related to new materialisms, speculative realism, Ray Bradbury, and those sort of stuff? Or does collapsology frames itself rather from a didactic effectiveness? What do you mean by that? Art, literature, even the formation of cults. I was thinking about this because I noticed that you work on collapse, even from this didactic perspective, when you release that card game, that like RPG
Yes.
game, which I think it's fun. I think it's sick. It fucking rules. But that's a rather didactic approach. And when we talk about didactic approaches, I think one has to get real about it and know that that is not let's say a political take on a specific issue, right? This is not to say that not having a political take on a specific issue is good or bad, but it's not political since it doesn't have a philosophical determinacy, rather a didactic one. So once again, my question is, will you say collapsology looks for philosophical determinacy, or rather didactic effectiveness?
Yeah, great question. So I guess like there's a, we will come to this, right? This is the final section of this lecture is what on the problem of what I describe as the indeterminate totality, and the question of these multiple dimensions as they interrelate and as they get expressed. I think I don't fully understand the distinction you're trying to make between didacticness and determinacy, or political determinacy, or philosophical determinacy. But maybe
Well,
we'll
just
talk
trying
about
to be
this.
like less diffuse, and trying to speak like broadly. It's just like saying, I mean, we are hyped about this acceleration and shit. Like, for example, all of the tech bros and all of the people taking positions, like actually existing positions, in what now is called like world building or terraforming, or all these positive framed words, which are just like masks for collapse, like fully induced collapse. But regardless if that's good or bad, they are making a political effort towards this, whether they like it or not. To assume that's what they're doing, and we know that they're doing that as well. We participate. It's as if now we're at a system where we are all implicated. Like the left is implicated. The left is not outside of it, right? It's part of the framework of action. In that sense, when one takes, for example, at a philosophical level, the ontological coordinates of thanatropism rather than teleology, quote unquote, getting somewhere politically or socially or at a civil level, stops being main point of reference. But for example, it becomes more useful for other sorts of approaches that humans have upon extension, collapse, atomic threats, you name it. The way in which humans use this effectively resonates with me in the sense that posthumanism is rather a literary effort. They make novels, they make literature, they make fiction or non-fiction, but it's literature. Those are not plans of national security. Those are not bioethical reflections on AI, for example. Those are not takes on reproduction. So that's where I see the difference between political determinacy and didactic effectiveness.
Okay,
they
cool.
attend the same issue.
I think that's important. So I don't want to defer that question endlessly, but I think I'm going to defer it until the second series of the seminar. So as I mentioned, there's another set of 4 lectures happening in May. You've got 3 months to wait. At which point I will talk about what I describe as medium design and like institutional design as particular kinds of ways of encountering collapse. So how can you design an institution that can weather collapse? How can you design an institution that responds adequately to collapse? What are the strategies for doing that? At that point, I will take a much more politically determinate view. For the time being, what I'm trying to do is sketch out a broad framework in which the ontological foundations of the kinds of stories that I'm going to tell you today in the traditional collapse literature are unsettled by the kinds of stories I'm going to tell you next week. Right, so I'll just skip forward in the seminar here. Ignore all this, ignore this, ignore this. Right, so there is what I'm just going to describe as the problem of the determinate totality. Like what kinds of levels or what kinds of things should we interpolate our story into? Is it a planetary story? Is it a sociological story? Is it a story of some like particular kind of period of 100 years? It seems to have an indefinitely large number of dimensions, much like the accelerationist story. And so there's a question of how do we reduce the dimensionality of our accounts and so on in order to respond adequately. I hope that will touch on something of what you're getting at there, but for the time being, I will now talk about Thucydides. Sorry, I will get to Casper's, August's and then Casper's as well. So August says, I'm fascinated in having a guilty pleasure in experiencing collapse. That, at least in Western culture, collapse fulfills the role of crisis in a civilizational hero's journey. And to what extent collapse could be accelerated by the desire for the experiencing of certain grand historical narratives in a postmodern culture? Yes, We will get to that in Spengler, who we'll talk about in a moment. That's a very important point. Thank you. Good. Yeah, good. Casper says, I'm wondering what collapsology looks like in other cultures, particularly China. Here we are, the remnants of three kingdoms. We'll get to that in a second. And ascendant power and geopolitical rival to the West. They're worried about birth rates too, but probably not so worried about democratic backsliding, or rather a lack of political agency, or other common tropes in collapse discourse here. Yes, I think the question of exactly how China and America both respond to their respective challenges and the way in which those entail or don't entail relying on each other is perhaps the most central question of the next 50 years in some ways. Okay, two more, and then I will definitely go on. Joel.
Hello, Richard. You talked about in your presentation about this heuristic problem of collapse, the symbolic failure that happens when collapses occur. I would like for you to talk a little bit more about that, what we could read, because that is the problem that interests me more. And I'm also, there was this recuperation of Wallerstein to talk about the situation in Brazil, where I'm from, and he deals with this problem of symbolic failure in the 17th century also. And the explanation that he gives is that there were like structural changes that happened in the 15th and the 16th century. And then all these revolts occur so that those societies could produce knowledge about themselves and reform their institutions. So could you talk a little bit more about that also? Because there is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that problem of the heuristics of collapse, right, is the sort of the general thing that we're going to be doing over the next sort of this lecture and the next one. I haven't spoken about the problem as such, although again I will do that in the final section of this lecture about the problem of the indeterminate totality. But I think that I'm trying to stage that problem, right? Try to stage the problem of how we get to a view of the whole, or how we get to an understanding of how our heuristics can be kind of like oriented towards the world as it actually is. Wallerstein is also a reference that will come up again in the fourth lecture on critical collapsology, on this question of how we assemble a sense of that global picture of capitalism that then can be assessed in its future. Marco says, there is a term fatigue using in structural engineering to explain the collapse of buildings due to the overload of their construction. I'm thinking about how this idea of exhaustion relates to the definitions of collapse you've mentioned. So there is a notion in collapse that is called overshoot, which is basically when you have, it's a relatively simple notion. You have some sort of what's called carrying capacity. This is a notion from ecology. So a certain area of land can support so much biomass and so many organisms and so on. Of course, they all, some of them eat each other. And then once you go past that carrying capacity, you enter into what's called overshoot, where you start to exhaust the processes that produce that capacity in the first place. And then you have a sudden decline in the capacity of the land or the ecology to produce or to sustain collections, people. We will come to that as well in session 2 about when we look at overshoot models. I think that's probably the closest thing you're going to get to a notion of fatigue in structural engineering. I'm assuming, although I don't know, I'm assuming that's something to do with like the introduction of sort of small cracks in materials that then turn into big cracks. But maybe you can help me out there.
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, I'm an architect, I'm not a structural engineer.
All right, but you know more about it than I do, I'm sure. Great, thank you. Great,
Thank you.
And is it Neem?
Yeah, Neve. Hi, did you say there's Graham before me or? No? Oh, okay, sorry. Hi. Yeah, I was just wanting to follow on Sensa's point there about the sort of dialectic of agency and, this kind of hyper consciousness of the human as the cause, let's say, of, climate change, which, as you mentioned, Benjamin Bratton, it's very much tied into computational systems of measurement, in the kind of kicking off in the 80s, I guess, kind of largely. But, analysis itself is a kind of breakdown. So, and in fact, you can actually even think about controlled collapse, you know, that feeds into a sort of risk society sort of management. And, you know, I'm just thinking about the sort of feedback loop where like there's a sort of rationale for norms, what we ought to do, you know, and that, I don't know, maybe this ties in a little bit about the didactic sort of element where it becomes a sort of moral kind of program. You know, that there are different kinds of drivers for action. So it's very kind of, you know, it's interesting to sort of unpack what the drivers are, because it's always a question of building adaptive structures, you know, whether or not, you know, we're in imminent collapse. That's just the nature of life on Earth. You know, there's a minimal level of collapse. Then I'm just kind of, yeah, just wondering about the ways of investing in, you know, and understanding our sort of political actions to sort of mitigate collapse, where there's such a pushback and it becomes ideological, you know, and there's ideological sort of divisions, and it really feeds very much back into that kind of whole, those kind of political, that kind of political sort of fracturing of our kind of society, of the social.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right about that. Was there a particular question, or was that?
Oh no, it was just a point actually, just to kind of the whole sort of dialectic of agency, and the kind of, you know, I guess on the one hand the sort of minimal level of collapse that we live with, you know, and it's you know, and now it's in hyper focus, you know, and you know, the sort of feedback loop of this dialectic of, you know, where we as humans are sort of seen as the cause of it, and then we're accelerating it as a result. But on the back of that, there are sort of moral actions about what we should do or ought to do. But it really depends on, you know, we could be quite pragmatic, you know, but we've actually almost probably got to fight for that space to be pragmatic, you know, but it might help to kind of think, well, actually, collapse is actually imminent to different degrees, no matter what. Yeah.
Yeah,
how that might change the picture, you know, in terms of actually being kind of pragmatic and really being quite constructive, you know, instead of actually accelerating it to the really big picture and, allowing that to kind of dominate and crush.
Do you have a particular smaller collapse in mind?
Well, I mean, even like everything from sort of quantum states, you know, and we have a, like, you know, inner, you know, we're as observers, we collapse quantum, you know, and we're sort of implicated in that kind of quantum state and the kind of creating that reality. And then in the sense of, you know, any of our structures, I mean, you know, there are some kind of schools of thought philosophically that everything is flow, and that actually, you know, human efforts to kind of, you know, to kind of defer that, you know, flow. That's all that our structures are about. You know, they're kind of forms of canalizing that flow. You know, so it does depend where philosophically where you start. You know, whether you start with this kind of everything is flow and everything, you know, flow is imminent, and in a lot of ways, you look at neoliberal discourses and it's very much about, you know, network society and flow, you know, and mobility. And that's kind of, you know, so that does create a kind of its own narrative, you know, and this kind of sense that actually, you know, we're sort of collapsing into that. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have a question. It's just more a point, really. Yeah.
I'm very excited that I feel like I'm just endlessly deferring things to later on. But what I hope this indicates is not that I'm sort of like being evasive, but that the kinds of questions you are asking are exactly the kinds of questions that I'm hoping to answer. Right? I think you are absolutely correct about the periodic process of collapse that happens sort of like relentlessly around us. I think that there's one thing that you said there that I want to sort of pick up on, or sort of you know, question, which is things collapsing is just the nature of life on Earth. And of course, there is always this problematic sort of translation between an organic metaphor and a social structure. And certainly I would say that there's a great deal of difference between the kinds of processes that induce collapse in a quantum state, where I'm not a quantum physicist, but I understand that collapse is not, it's just like a useful word there. It doesn't really signify collapse as such. It's more of a decision that is made between
Yeah,
some
yeah.
kind of spin, and then and the forms of collapse that happen in societies. And I think the crucial difference there, to some extent, is the kind of thing that you're pointing to about moralism, because I think that social relations are embedded in systems of morality or embedded systems of ethics, and I think that trying to extract ourselves from those and then say, okay, well, we'll get rid of the normative drive and we'll just be sort of pragmatic about it, I think it just describes an almost like managerial approach to what that morality is. So if we try and say we're going to get rid of ethics and we're going to just do pragmatism, I think we end up in the system where we end up in a place where we do something that is ethically loaded, but I would say perhaps rather sort of not reflected upon to the fullest extent. Like I think pragmatism is a cover in some ways for what happens. And I think that it is at the level of societies where you definitely get this level of mutual moral ethical comportment, because that is the level at which we owe things to each other. We are indebted in some ways to each other. Again, there's a whole problem with the kind of question of indebtedness there, and I will come back to that at some point. But I get where you're going, and I think it's a really interesting set of questions. Perhaps I can now also say that in relation to I think what Senza was asking about this sort of ontology, that the position I will end up with in critical collapsology in the fourth session is that institutions, properly called, are forms of what I describe as gully formations in state space. So there are forms of state space, right? There are forms of the organization of there are sets of possible states for systems, and an institution is a way of canalizing it, right? So exactly the thing you were saying there about channeling and organizing systems of flows, and that society consists of this vast stitching together of different ways of canalizing particular kinds of flow. But that institutions, and those institutions that we currently have pathologies, externalizations, forms of dumping, and in the applied collapsology section, we'll go through 3 layers of this: the displacement of complexity, the encapsulation of complexity, and the production of complexity. I think this also goes back to what you were saying, Carsten, about this sort of juxtaposition of growth versus collapse, which I think is my point, is that there are actually endless dialectics between these two different things, right? Growth and collapse, and growth and collapse, and growth and collapse. They are mutually imbricated, and I think that's supposed to be sort of putting. I think that speaks to all of your things there, Senza, Name, and Carsten. I will, however, say that I think that this I want to push back on the notion that we know what the frame is, right? That we know what the frame is, that we can say, okay, well, now we're just dealing with capitalism. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Marxism, but I'm not going to just say like, okay, this is capitalism. This is just like the social process of reproduction. I'm also not going to say that this is just the nature of life on Earth and so on. I'm not going to say like, this is my ontology. Now let's see what's out there in the process. I think the process comes before the ontology. I think the process is the thing we're experiencing is this endless series of unexpected moments of contingency in history, right? This comes back to your question, Senza, like, this question I've got at the bottom, how to understand historical time in light of a new catastrophism, is my attempt to answer your question, Senza, now that I think I'm more fully understanding it, right? Which is that what is catastrophic in history is not just that things break down, but that the number of dimensions along which we understand and express history is continually entering into crisis, right? There is an endless crisis of ontology, an endless crisis of the question of what are the driving historical actors, what are the driving institutions. And what I'm going to try and do over the course of this week and next is, as I say, stage this problem, whereby we come to understand that people really, really, really disagree about like what those fundamental structures are, about what that ontology is, what the relationship of growth and so on is. And so without further ado, I will actually now do the second part of the lecture. That was brilliant. Thank you so much for asking such wonderful and penetrating questions. That's really, really useful. This is the Thucydides trap. This is actually not the first in a sort of chronological sequence, because it's an invention of Graham Allison, who uses the term, which comes from, or rather the notion comes from Thucydides' famous History of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Right? He says that Graham Allison says that what made war inevitable, sorry, this is a quote from the Peloponnesian War, what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which is caused in Sparta. And from this, Graham Allison draws this central problem, right? Which is that there is a severe structural stress placed on one power, a currently existing dominant power, when a rising power comes to take its place. You can think about like lots of examples of this. It's very clear they don't all end in war. The Genoese, the Dutch, the British, the English rather, the Americans. These are transitions in historical time between dominant global empires that do not end in war. Well, they end in war, but they don't end in war between the two different powers, right? You can think about the sort of counterfactual case here, which is that Germany in 1914 would like to be the dominant world power, and certainly in Europe is looking pretty impressive. And then the First World War is an attempt to shut that down. And so we have this other example where it does end in war, but the transition doesn't happen because Germany obviously loses. But the point is that in these moments of interregnum, in these moments of moving between, on the one hand, a dominant, stable hyperpower, classic example here is, of course, America in the 1990s. You can also think about Britain in the 1870s and so on. You know, there is a single moment of power, and then they are challenged by something else. As I say, doesn't always happen. This is the framework people use often to describe the coming of a new Cold War between America and China. And Allison says something quite peculiar here in this last quote, which is that ruling powers' fears often fuel misperceptions and exaggerate dangers. And rising power self-confidence stimulates unrealistic expectations about what is possible and encourages risk-taking. Now, you will note he is pointing out two different forms of rationality. Let's say America, which is the current dominant power, versus China. So America has this dominant, position, and it exaggerates danger from China. But China, which is unrealistic in Allison's sort of initial terms. China, a rising power, has unrealistic expectations about what it can achieve, and therefore it encourages risk-taking. That's also a kind of, in Allison's term, a kind of irrationality. But like many things, you will notice that they become rational because they are both irrational, right? So you will notice that it becomes rational for America to worry about China precisely because China has irrational expectations and therefore might do something risky, right? And therefore it becomes rational for America to think seriously about it. And so although it's very easy to point to Graham Allison's actual formulation of it and say, look, this is just like a kind of a nonsense, a kind of projection, I think there is a sort of an inner logic to it that is actually more compelling than it might originally seem. I'm going to have to go very quickly through these things, unfortunately. This is The Romance of Three Kingdoms. It is the most famous novel in Chinese history. It's very, very long. I have not read the whole of it, I'm going to admit. And basically what it narrates is a crisis in the second and third centuries in China. And it inaugurates this sort of thing that I think is often quoted, perhaps lacking depth, lacking other reading in Chinese history, which I'm certainly guilty of to some extent. The empire long divided must unite, long united must divide. Thus it has ever been, right? There is an endless cyclical process. And this, I think, goes back to what we're talking about with Chinese historiography or its own internal collapses. This cyclical nature of imperial or political centralization and decentralization. This actual collapse in history was enormous. It moved from 56 million people in the Han periods, that's before 220, through to 16 million in 280. So that is an enormous drop. There are questions. This is the Western Jin who are conducting this particular census. But there are questions about whether or not they actually did the census properly. They seem to have done it relatively well. Enormous drop off. That's mostly famine, direct war, disease, and so on. At the same time, of course, it's also a period of impressive technological advancement. The repeating crossbow, for example, is one of the things that is developed at this time. There are sort of various wonders of the world using magnets and so on that are developed. And in the story, in The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, we get this sort of blend of corruption, dissatisfaction amongst the peasants, leading to what's called the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And then following that warlordism, you get three different groups. And then the question of the mantle of heaven. So at least traditional Chinese historiography, there is this notion of the mantle of heaven that is imbued upon particular political structures, and then they lose it when disaster strikes. And often this is a sequence of disasters. Now, interestingly, as we'll see a bit later, there are good, valid historical scientific reasons for thinking that disasters might come together in various concatenations. And we'll go through those in a bit. So this is why you get rising inequality, and then you get plagues, and you get so on, right? Because they all sort of come together for reasons that are relatively straightforward and I think quite easy to state. Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is probably the most important collapsologist who people have probably never heard of, although he's also very famous, so maybe you have. He is a philosopher, a writer, a jurist. He spends most of his time actually in courts, being a judge. And he's interested in law and history. He's one of these famous Muslim polymaths. He is writing in a moment after both a sort of personal defeat in some ways, about a century before. His family, which is very powerful in Seville, when it was a Muslim town in Spain, they were kicked out about a century before, and so his family has suffered a kind of like a loss of status. He's now in North Africa, but he's also writing politically at the moment after the collapse of the caliphate. So in 1258, people will probably know, the Mongols invade Baghdad, and they wrap the last caliph up in a mat and they stamp on him with horses, because they are worried that I can see a few grimaces, and they're worried that the ground will not appreciate the spilling of royal blood onto it. So this is the kind of the political scene that he's birthed into. He also comes before the Ottoman Empire, right? So there is this moment of interregnum in the late medieval Muslim world. But he's nevertheless formed by that world, and then he writes in 1377 the Muqaddimah, sorry, and then in 1401 he meets Timur, or also known as Tamerlane, one of the great Turkic conquerors, and for whom he actually who forms a sort of a confirmation of his theory. His theory goes like this. There are many more dimensions to it, but like this is the sort of the core of it, the rational core, I think. People attempt to do reunification. They emerge from the peripheries of empires. And the reason they emerge at the periphery is because there are higher bonds of social solidarity, what is called asabiya in the original term. People have greater levels of social cohesion. Because of the deprivations of the desert, it's difficult to survive in the desert. People struggle. They must bond together. They are then capable of forming various kinds of banditry and various kinds of military tactic. Horse archers are the kind of key part here. And they're able to destroy the ruling class of the town and take over. Within 4 generations, no more, no less, some is less, but no more. Within no more than 4 generations, those newly installed leaders will grow accustomed to the comforts of the city. They will grow weak, they will grow effeminate, and they will begin to lack cohesion. They will split amongst themselves. There'll be a new dynasty that takes it over. This is a cyclical theory of pessimistic lack of political control. He's trying to explain turbulence, broadly speaking, in North Africa. And he introduces this sort of tension between the urban and the primitive, right? The nomad and the merchant, the desert city, orality and literacy. Another sort of new center mainstay is, of course, Deleuze Guattari's chapter on nomadology from the Thousand Plateaus, which I think people might sort of have some sort of thing to say about that. This is his position on sedentary life, on the life of the city. It constitutes the last stage of civilization and the last point where it begins to, and the point where it begins to decay. It also constitutes the last stage of evil and remoteness from goodness. Ibn Khaldun is, of course, a religious thinker. He thinks that the correct way of being is according to Islam, right? And this is a sort of theory that we will come back to many times. Sedentary life as a sort of deprivation, as a sort of a disaster waiting to happen. Certainly, as someone who lives in a big city, I like to think this is not the case. Despite what Ibn Khaldun is describing, at the same time, the actual period he's writing about, although it's a period of massive political turbulence, is a period of stabilization in a whole set of other dimensions. So we have what you might describe as thin states, people who are coming around to do tax collection, people who are coming around to conscript you into their army, people who are running various kinds of religious functions. but they're not integrated into your life in the same kind of way as you might think a modern state as being. And therefore, although there is this top level at which everything is chaotic, everything is changing very rapidly, people are coming, being murdered, people are being replaced, actually, there is an underlying expression of social and cultural life that is becoming more stable over the same time period. And so it's very interesting, I think, to think about whether or not, when we describe collapse, when we think about the possibility of collapse, are we just describing political turmoil, right? Or are we describing actually forms of embedded changes in the structure of people's daily life? Interestingly, he's quoted by Ronald Reagan. This is not relevant to my argument, perhaps, but it's an interesting little tidbit. In 1981, Ronald Reagan quotes him approvingly in favor of supply-side economic arguments. His basic argument is that you should reduce taxes because that will encourage growth. And when you have more growth, you will collect more taxes from the growth that happens afterwards. So you can reduce taxes in order to boost tax revenue. Sort of contradictory theory, became very popular in the 1980s and was very influential on American tax policy. There's also this problem of 19th century degeneracy theory, in which the city, because it has this noted dysgenic aspect, which is that people in cities don't have as many children as people in the countryside. So you get this process of people who are smart or have high IQs in the sort of the pseudoscience of the day, right? Sorry, this is early 20th century, not 19th century. But they move to the city. They have fewer children, and then because they have fewer children, you have fewer smart people because IQ is to some extent heritable, right? And so you have this problem of the degeneracy of cities, that they produce overall less competent populations. This is a kind of a consequence, I think, to some extent, of Ibn Khaldun's pessimism about life. This is Tomarus. This is painted, I think, by Rubens. This is one of the terrifying steppe commanders. She's a queen, actually. You see here she's pregnant. And she is getting the care of Cyrus and is being dumped. This is and the reason why I have this here is not just like it's extraordinary sort of object as a photo, right? This kind of terrifying barbarian queen. But also, of course, everyone looks like a white European, apart from like one or two, right? Because it's Rubens. But also there's these Turkic invasions from the Great Eurasian Steppe haunt European political thought for a very long time, right? There is a dynamic, not just the one that Ibn Khaldun is talking about, of barbarians and people outside the city, nomads and the sedentary, but this much grander scale in which the whole of Europe is threatened by the possibility of an invasion from the steppes, and indeed the Middle East as well at the same time. There's a bunch of them. Tomarus of the Scythians, Merdu Chanyu of the Xiongnu, Attila of the Han, of course, people have heard of this, Genghis Khan, of course, and then the event I alluded to earlier, which sort of ends a period of expansion of the Muslim world, or ends a period of solidification of the Muslim world, which is the execution of the last Caliph of Baghdad. And then Ibn Khaldun meets, as a sort of confirmation of his theory of the strong outsider nomadist, he meets Timur, and they have a conversation about a month while the siege of not Baghdad but Damascus is going on. So he's literally sitting in his tent discussing politics, discussing kind of history with this guy while he is sieging Damascus. I think there are very few contemporary historians who would be allowed to do something quite so cool as that. The crucial dynamic here is horse archers, right? As I mentioned before, it's horse archers and stirrups. So what this means is that you can rush towards an army, you can feign retreat, and then you can ambush them as they come back towards you. And so you get this endless push and pull dynamic, almost impossible to defeat. Edward Gibbon, in part of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, has, I have to say, a rather uneasy sounding reassurance that this will not happen anymore. This is in the very last section, his kind of final summation essay. But we'll get back to that in a second. This is just here as a prompt. If people think about nomadology, you might want to think about Ibn Khaldun, right? He's kind of an interesting figure. Deleuze and Guattari do talk about him. They make the clarification that agriculture, so it's the outside, the Great Plains, are still part of the city, right? So they're not like, it's not like it's just the city itself. It includes this peri-urban space. And then there's also a sort of question we can ask, which is that, well, does the cycle of breakdown happen in the case of Timur? We get the Timurid Renaissance in Samarkand, in modern day Uzbekistan. We get this, which is a very nice form of chess. it's what's called Tamerlane chess. Tamerlane and Timur are the same person. And it's basically a kind of a more advanced version of, or some more sophisticated version of chess. If you would like to play Tamerlane chess with me, I've never played it, and I'm bad at chess, but I will play Tamerlane chess with you if you message me on the Discord. So this is your invitation to that. There's a very interesting quotation, at least for me, a very interesting quotation or claim rather, that Alan James Fernherz, who writes a biography of Ibn Khaldun, makes, which is that the medieval period begins with the loss of hope. And the place we can define this beginning of the medieval period is not necessarily with the end of the Roman Empire as such, but is with the final extinction of the possibility of its recovery. And it's really this kind of periodization of hope. And what we can coherently hope for? As I mentioned before, a large part of the motivation for thinking about collapse for me is this question of what I can meaningfully hope from the future. Right? I think this is a kind of interesting and provocative moment. It's also very crucially well outside the ontology, to go back to that conversation about accelerationism, well outside the ontology, we might try and inherit from accelerationism. Hopefulness is not the kind of thing that gets admitted into these discussions very often, and nor is it the kind of thing that gets admitted in discussions of existential risk very much. There is a thing called existential hope, but it's a bit different. Edward Gibbon. So Edward Gibbon is the most famous collapsologist in the English language. He writes The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, one of those kind of classic books that people have encountered but not read. And it's written during this period of major upheaval. It's written during the period of the American Revolution. And then it's written sort of partly in France, partly in Switzerland, around the time of the French Revolution. He's a member of Parliament, he's a member of the British upper class. And so you can imagine, although he's a non-juring, so he doesn't swear fealty to the right kinds of bishops. So he's outsider in British society in some ways, although he's famously very charming and very nice. He's a member of Parliament. He's sufficiently wealthy at the time. This is before the Reform Act, so this is like being a member of Parliament is just like you're just a guy, right? You're just like a random aristocrat. Like no one really votes for you, well they do, but like they it's not really significant. It's not democratic in the same kind of way as it is now. And so there's a question here about like what Gibbon is trying to smuggle into his account that will scandalize the people of his day that he can't say directly. And the famous example, the famous response to this is that Edward Gibbon is trying to blame Christianity for the fall of the Roman Empire. How does he do this? So I'm not going to read this whole quote, but this is from that last section, that last sort of that summation essay. And look at the second quote. As the happiness of a future life is the great object of religion, we may hear without surprise or scandal that the introduction, or at least the abuse of Christianity, very important caveating phrase, had some influence on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The clergy successfully preached the doctrines of patience and pusillanimity. The active virtues of society were discouraged, and the last remains of military spirit were buried in the cloister. A large portion of public and private wealth was consecrated to the specious demands of charity and devotion, and the soldiers' pay was lavished on the useless multitudes of both sexes who could only plead the merits of abstinence and chastity. There was a lot of anger in this quote, right, about the fall of the Roman Empire, about the ways in which Christianity has deprived the world of the Roman Empire, although Gibbon is very mixed, has very mixed thoughts about empire in general. And you could sort of see Gibbon as fighting one of the major battles of this time period, which is this question of whether or not the modern world, Gibbon's own world, has reached the same sort of status or heights as the Roman Empire, right? And in some ways, he is trying to answer that yes, it has that, partially, almost directly, because it is slowly, very slowly, beginning to overcome Christianity. There are many more things Gibbon writes about. It's impossible to summarize this book. It's very long. Do read it. It's very funny. It's very funny. I did mean to say that. It is very funny. Possibly the most complex historiography of the Roman Empire is that of the Roman Empire. So like 219 different explanations for collapse. And there are an endless series of alternate explanations. Wealth pumps. A wealth pump is when you have a social process that moves money systematically from the lower classes up to the upper classes. That's a very important key social dynamic. You get plagues. obviously bad governance, the problem of the emperor, right, and the random decisions that emperors make. Obviously, there are civil wars in the late Roman Empire that describe that clearly bad for the empire in very obvious ways. There is betrayals. There are members of the guards of emperors who declare themselves emperor, and then all kinds of dramatic things happen. There's military overexpansion, and most interestingly, I think, and most sort of contemporaneously seeming contemporary relevance, highest contemporary relevance, is the end of the Roman climatic optimum. This is a period of strikingly different weather from its outside. So Ice Age ends, you get a long period of relative cold, the Roman climatic optimum comes along, changes the climate of the Mediterranean, makes it much easier to do farming, makes it much easier to do various kinds of things that Romans rely on. And then that ends because of climatic change, not because the Roman Empire has caused it. Right? It's not like our climate change. It's not like they're doing anything in particular. It's just a cyclical process or a non-cyclical process. But I think it's happening outside their boundaries. And this is why I think it's important to maintain a kind of ontological openness, because the Romans didn't understand their own climate. Right? They didn't understand that it could change. They just thought it was different in different places, and they knew it went up in the summer and down in the winter. They had no serious science of climate. And yet, if they had maintained something like ontological openness, right, they might have noticed this and been able to adjust to it. Not that I think it's a serious possibility, but I think there's a possibility of ontological closure in our accounts of our own possible collapse, which is that we end up blind to various kinds of risks that are important. There are syntheses between these different things. Peter Turchin notes that when you get a very wealthy elite, they compete amongst themselves for luxury goods. Where do luxury goods come from? Necessarily, they come from a long way away. What does a long way away have? Zoonotic diseases, right? So you extend trade lines further and further and further, extend trade lines into China, into India, go much further than they've gone before, in pursuit of unusual things. That means that you bring back delicacies at the same time you bring back diseases. What this means is that the wealth pump has already added to social stress, right? It's already put us in a position where there are inequalities in society. That means that plagues tend to afflict societies that are already unequal. And this is how we get to a sort of a relatively scientific explanation of how it is that we end up with this kind of object in Chinese historiography, the mantle of heaven, being lost in a series of seemingly unrelated crises that signify the end of times. Because these crises are not unrelated. They're actually processes that sort of unfurl in a single way. This is a non-Marxist account of how the polycrisis might turn out to be a single crisis, right? But the causation of at least our present crisis is at least opaque to me. Maybe it's not opaque to you, but it's opaque to me. Very quickly, Spengler. Spengler thinks that societies are basically humans, or they're organismic. They have periods, they have seasons, they have a process. Each one is defined by a single unified symbol. You will be pleased to know, perhaps, that the symbol for Western or Faustian culture is a kind of relation to space, looking at the distant horizon. That is the symbol. And this sort of symbol has a sort of seasonality. At the first stage, it's a principally agrarian society, and then it develops a relation to the cities. And then this dynamic between the cities and the countryside becomes flourishing. And at the end, we get this deprivation, which is, again, like Ibn Khaldun's theory, a theory of the degeneracy of the city and the metropolis that comes to dominate the culture, that lacks the vitality that the relationship between the countryside and the city had. He is again speaking to contemporary events. He publishes The Decline of the West immediately after the First World War. Massive success. He becomes a celebrity in Germany, partly because he is able to describe for Germans eager to understand why they have lost the war. He's able to describe to them that their story of destruction, which seems like a failure, is no, it's not. It's actually in this kind of much longer process. It's actually much in this kind of almost overdetermined process. To come back to your these thoughts about pragmatism and collapse, Adorno's criticism of Spengler, and Adorno is someone I take relatively seriously. Adorno's criticism of Spengler is that his excessive facticity. He is focused only what is. He's on focus. He's a sort of relentless positivist. This seems like a very strange criticism to me, but let's try and take it seriously. What he means by this is that Spengler is unable to see that there are things outside of society. He can see that there are values circulating in society. You can see that the liberal values of, freedom, equality, and so on. He can see these exist, but he sees that they are not instantiated in the Germany of his day. Fair enough. He sort of concludes by thinking that these values are themselves wrong, or they are themselves only mere covers. And Adorno wants to maintain the possibility that these values are good, real, but they are not reflected in present society. And this is why I'm saying that I think pragmatism has its own kind of falteringness, or it produces its own kinds of problems. Because when we say we are pragmatic, we are saying something like we should stick to the facts. But what the facts are, I don't think is clear. And when we exclude things like normative judgments from the way in which we approach the question of philosophy, we become fatalistic. But also, Adorno notes, we become almost necessarily a kind of reactionary, which Spengler obviously is that we give into what power tells us is possible, or what seems possible because of the institutions of power, and we ignore the fact that we can make a world that is otherwise. And in that sense, I think there is something to be hoped for from something to be essential in the holding fast to a kind of normativity in the approach to the question of collapse. So Jared Diamond, people will have, who's read the Jared Diamond book? Yeah, it's a popular book. It's not a disastrous book. That's not a hugely great review, but it's not a disastrous book. It does have some interesting things to say about environmentalism, and it has a notion of environmental disaster that I think is interesting to think about. However, as everyone probably knows, there are big problems with Jared Diamond's conception of how collapse works. The main one is that he lacks an account of social mediation. There's this book called Questioning Collapse, which I recommend people, Questioning Collapse, not Questioning Diamond, Questioning Collapse, which I recommend people go and read. It is an edited volume by Patrice McNaney and Norman Yofi, who are two academics, they're both archaeologists, and they argue that there are these sort of profound collection of problems with Jared Diamond's account. This book, the Questioning Collapse one, is basically a chapter by chapter refutation of Jared Diamond's work. If your book inspires that kind of response, you've done something wrong. So the basic sort of methodological question that the thing they point to is that Diamond has an account of collapse that is almost entirely driven by decision making and foolish decision making at the level of societies as a whole. He treats them basically as unitary objects, although he does, as was mentioned on the previous slide, have a notion of an elite that can isolate itself from the process of collapse, and that's one of the reasons why that it doesn't get addressed. That is a kind of a proto-class theory, but he doesn't explore it in a great deal of depth. And they point out that there's a sort of sleight of hand where we move from what we might describe as methodological individualism, which Jared Diamond is very fond of because he thinks it makes things clearer to understand. He also has another book called Upheaval, which is about the moments in history when societies were forced to make some sort of big choice, and they sort of either successfully navigate that or don't successfully navigate that. It's also a very strange book in lots of ways because it is based on the basic notion that these kinds of decisions that societies have to make are essentially equivalent to the kinds of decisions people have to make in their own lives. The example he gives is he was pursuing a PhD in the 1950s or 60s perhaps at Cambridge University. He wasn't very happy at Cambridge, so he's like, well, maybe I should go back to Yale. He decides ultimately to go back to Yale, and he says this is basically the kind of decision everyone else has to make that Finland made at the end of the Second World War. Like, this is not a plausible social ontology, unfortunately. And so he lacks an account of the way in which societies are organized internally, but also he lacks an account of what we might describe as social forcing. So the ways in which particular social structures, and this goes back to the structure agency question, he lacks an account of the ways in which particular structures come to pressure particular institutions in society to make certain decisions. Is there a level of abstraction in your society, an abstract social structure that pushes you to make certain kinds of decisions. Jared Diamond doesn't seem to know or to account for what that is in almost all the cases. Last example here, and then I'll go into the sort of the question of indeterminate totality. And this is Niall Ferguson. Niall Ferguson is a British historian who, no, is he an Irish historian perhaps? It's a bad mistake to make. Niall Ferguson is a historian who wrote a book called Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe. And if you read this book, which I think it's a good book in terms of like, it's very well written, it's very pacey, it's fast and written very rapidly during the pandemic, and therefore suffers from a kind of methodological weakness, which is that he's keen to assemble a kind of grab bag of different theories for different times. So he talks about Peter Turchin, who we'll talk about next week. He talks about Joseph Tainter, who we'll talk about next week as well. He talks about the sort of clear dynamics theory that Peter Turchin has assembled. He talks about overshoot. He talks about Jared Diamond. He talks about a whole collection of people. And then he doesn't quite actually make a decision between how to understand these different things, not unreasonably. It's not an unreasonable thing to do to not come to a final determination of what the dimensions are of your theory. But he counters the problem of indeterminate totality, which I'm going to describe on the next slide, by adopting a heterogeneity of explanation. So it's like different things happen at different times, which is obviously true in some some particular level of description. It's also not very helpful. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to take some water. I'm going to think about how to explain it. You can see people have very, very, very different views of what causes a collapse. Some of these views you might think are very obviously not to be taken seriously. Some of these views you might think are very clearly have a prescient or understand something interesting about the world that maybe we've lost in modern sociology. But there is a problem here of reducing the dimensionality, right? It's not admissible. It's not really possible to say, we'll just have them all, right? Because then you end up with a map of your territory that is as large as the territory itself. And you end up in a kind of fatalism. You end up in, or not fatalism, but you end up in a kind of lacking anything to do. You end up simply endlessly describing more and more and more facts. But if you want to have a political project, and this goes back to what Senza was talking about, if you want to have a political project, you also need to have a definite number of determinate dimensions for that political project. That means you need to know how the society is operating, what are its broad dimensions, and so on. The problem is, for collapsology, what we're describing, to some extent, is a kind of social process that we do not in the first place understand, and the way in which it comes to an end, right? The way in which it breaks down. That breakdown itself generates new kinds of dimensionality, new kinds of complexity. Is there a general model? Can we get to a general model? I mentioned earlier that there was this in the historiography of Rome, there are these moments of synthesis, which I think are very interesting, very compelling. Is there the kind of possibility of the same kind of thing there? And there's another question which I've sort of been hinting to earlier, which is when we're thinking about sort of trying to forestall a kind of closure when we say something like, this is just how societies are, this is just how life is, this is just how things work. To forestall a kind of closure that I think is necessary not only for descriptive reasons, but also where I think there is a kind of normative requirement for political projects to not have that kind of closure, which is the critique Adorno makes of Spengler. He says, Spengler is a reactionary because he thinks he's cynical about power. He thinks it is only ever the operation of power and not the possibility of this sort of normative layer of value forming. So is there a kind of benign indeterminacy where we try and look for things that exceed our current expectations or exceed our current ontology? Can we bring in things that I've described here, like a periodization of hope? Should we understand our history in a much broader term? Like, should we not understand it as a problem of social collapse, but at the kind of register, at the kind of scale that people were talking about earlier in relation to the accelerationism debate? Like, should we understand it in as a sort of planetary process? Is what we are facing now more like the Great Oxidation event than the fall of Rome? And for this like head-spinning question, I'm indebted to Bo Caprice-Vetch, who's the co-author of this sort of emerging book project. The great oxidation event, just people don't know, is an event in geological history, planetary history, at which various kinds of photosynthesizing bacteria evolve, and they produce free oxygen in the atmosphere. And that free oxygen is corrosive to the existing archaeans. I'm really showing the limits of my planetary knowledge here. Archaeans, right, which were a kind of a different kind of organism that lived before, for whom oxygen is a poison. And so you get these new kinds of organisms that dump gas into the atmosphere. That gas then ends up destroying the previous rounds of organisms. Are we looking at a scale of social process that is something more equivalent to that? And so this is how I see the challenge. A challenge of reducing the dimensionality of our accounts, by which I mean not simply listing everything or producing a sort of a thing that has everything in it, an account of collapse that simply has everything, without doing these 5 things. Making dimensions that are almost entirely vague. This is something else we can talk to in Diamond's work. Diamond says that all problems are environmental problems. Well, not all. But Diamond says that the majority of problems are environmental problems. He then goes on to specify 12 different kinds of environmental problems, which suggests that there's a kind of heterogeneity inside that. And like the way he understands that heterogeneity doesn't make environmentalism a useful dimension to us. Can we do it without the very obvious problem of excluding important dimensions? If there's your view of collapse of the present is focused on climate change, but has nothing to say about artificial intelligence, or has nothing to say about nuclear war, and one of those 2 things happens, then you've not produced the right account. Can we do it without losing sight of social forcing? So one aspect of having a sort of what I almost think of as like a news-oriented account of collapse is that you end up just simply listing things that are happening and the agents that are happening, the agents that are doing them, and you lose an account of this broad social forcing process. This is also another problem of Jared Diamond's account, right? Is that he lacks an account of what social forcing is. Can we do so without lapsing into pessimism about power and mere relativism about values? Not that I'm not some sort of soft relativist, I probably am, but I'm not a hard relativist. I don't think that it's just a matter of gains. And can we do that without reducing the role of contingency in history? So this is the opposite problem to social forcing. To say that, oh, everything is sort of procedurally just determined, everything happens, just because this like long story of either, capital accumulation or of the unfolding of the symbol of society, or of the necessary cycle of the relation between nomadic people and sedentary people, without reducing contingency, can we produce an account of collapse? And there is this kind of mindset that this requires, which is the collapsological mindset, which requires a kind of multi-scale indeterminacy. But, and this is my strongest claim, precisely because it requires embracing multi-scale indeterminacy, it requires powerful synthesizing abstractions to embrace the multidimensionality. And this is the thing that I'm going to try and build the theory of critical collapsology on later on in the 4th session. So this is how I'm going to ask this question. Can we respond to the notion of the heterogeneity of explanations for collapse? Can we produce powerful abstractions that allow us to understand how it is our society is reproduced without losing sight of all these different dimensions that I've already pointed to, without doing these kind of 5 errors, that allows for us to grasp the world that we currently live in, but may not live in for much longer? We've already asked this question, but I wonder if people have sort of new thoughts on it, or if they want to introduce themselves in some other way. We have now 10 minutes to do that. I'm sorry that took so long. I did not expect it to. In the next session, I'll just tell you what we're doing. So many of the things we talked about will be talked about again, but in more plausible ways. So we have the Size of Collapse literature review, a great paper from a couple of years back, just like tells you what all the theories are. Not the ones that I've told you about today. I think mostly they're not in there because they're regarded as a bit too woo. But the new theories, talks about those. We're going to talk about navigating polycrisis. So the question of like, how do societies respond to these kind of problems? How do they get out of them? Not everything ends in collapse. Almost nothing, in fact, ends in collapse. Then we're going to talk about a controversial, but I think extremely useful paper by Luke Kemp. I mentioned, I think, at the very beginning, on democratizing risk, which is basically makes the charge that the field of existential risk has become needlessly authoritarian. We're going to talk about Laurie Laban and his work for Chatham House on the security blind spot, which basically argues as a kind of rhetorical strategy that we should emphasize aspects of security when we're thinking about severe climate change risk. And we might want to ask a question about whether or not that's actually the kind of thing you want to do, about whether or not you actually want the military as your sort of sharpest point of contact with climate change. And then we'll talk about this paper I mentioned again earlier called Gradual Disempowerment, which tries to look at the question of how might an AI gradually remove humans from consideration, not by killing them all, not by destroying everything, but by simply removing their entire set of concerns from consideration. So we've got 10 minutes to talk. I'm sorry that took so long. Please do write questions, comments in the chat. As ever, if you want to feedback and so on, Discord channel, email, here, all good. Thoughts? Yeah, great. So question from James. You might have already covered this, but what do you see as the important distinctions between the Great Oxidation Event and the Fall of Rome in terms of blueprints for understanding collapse? They're very different, right? I think perhaps that question is meant to be a provocation. Right? It's meant to be a sort of a sort of spanner in the works of trying to think about this problem rather than a real question. The main thing that I think is important there is that I think that societies are real. I think that societies are real and they contain forms of normativity and you have their own sort of internal dynamics. And there is no normativity on a prehistoric planet where one group of agents produces a thing a gas that kills another group of agents. There's no normative basis to that at all. It's just sort of mechanical process. In that sense, I think that the main kind of differences there are questions of the kinds of agents that exist, right? And the kinds of ways in which agents are able to model their environments, to restructure their environments. Processes, I think, are latent with normativity. That requires us to now respond in a similar kind of way to model our own environment, to try and organize, to reorganize our own environment in a new way. Gerard says, I'm really interested in exploring this heuristic aspect of collapse. Maybe I misunderstand what the question is. I think of, yeah, maybe you could say a bit more about what the question is. I thought I was covering a bit later, a bit earlier rather. I thought that was kind of what I was trying to get at with the indeterminate totality. Maybe I don't understand what the question is. So we have, yeah, maybe you could talk to that, maybe either in writing. How can we balance, so while waiting for Joel, how can we balance the 4 pillars of speculative realism with collapse? Object-oriented ontology, nature, artifactual mind, and re-enchantment. I'm not an expert in any of those things. I don't know a great deal about speculative realism, unfortunately. The way in which I encountered the conversation about accelerationism was not through the speculative realist route. So I'm not sure that I will be able to respond adequately to that. I can think about it. I don't. My presumption is that I think that collapse as a process, as a kind of a crash space, to go back to my earlier description, undoes the notion that those categories mean anything. Is that those categories are themselves a kind of, oh, they don't mean anything. They are kind of a temporary historical moment. And what I'm really pointing to with thinking about collapse, philosophically, I guess, speaking, is that there is this, and this again is like getting into a kind of philosophical language that I'm not sure I can really sustain. Something like a kind of base materiality, a kind of base aspect to the process of history that takes revenge upon our grand schemes, right? And in that sense, I think that those seem like one of those schemes. Obviously, I'm not totally pessimistic about that. I'll have a think about this question. I'll get back to you. Anything else? I will take silence as me having fully answered all the questions to the fullest possible extent, and nothing else. Okay. Yes, Carsten. 2 practical questions. I don't know. I'm sorry. Does your where are you, Carsten?
I'm based in Amsterdam, and I was just seeing different times on the calendar. Sorry.
That strikes me as unlikely.
Okay.
Unlikely. It's 2 p.m. in the UK, which is where real time exists. Okay, so can I talk about final products?
Sorry, just to maybe say that, I mean, I'm not sure, but could it be that there's also a time zone change at some point? Like we're switching to the summer calendar or something like that?
That's actually possible.
I'm not sure. I'm just speculating, but I can double check and get back to you.
Your final project can be an essay, can be a video work, it can be more or less any. I haven't been given any guidance on this, so I'm now making this up. But in terms of things that I would like you to see make, is I would like to see something that you think encounters the problem of collapse in a way that is meaningful for you. That could be something very practical. It could be something very straightforward. It could be something incredibly intricate. It could be something written. It could be something made. It could be a project on the outside world. Yuval, do you have any more guidance for me on that? Because I feel like now I'm just getting people to do things they won't be able to get credit for. So I'm happy with whatever you do, but I would love to see you do something. Yeah.
Yeah, I will send. We have to do presentations at some point. I don't know, Richard, how you were thinking about this.
Okay, so presentations. If you've not been to a New Center course before, basically what happens is that in each of the different seminars, people will present the readings. So I've assigned you some readings. Has everyone got the readings? Yeah. So I've assigned the readings. There'll be a spreadsheet circulated. You can assign yourself in the remaining 3 weeks of this course a particular reading. And you can say, I want to talk about that one. Someone else will already be in that, in that thing, in that box, hopefully, because then we've got enough people for that. Meet up with that person, contact them on Discord or in the Google Classroom, make a presentation together, present it in the following, whenever your presentation is due. So there'll be the reading presentations are due in the week of the reading. So next week, I'll just show you this again one more time. So next week, I can just tell you what these readings are so you can know which one interests you. Societal Collapse Literature Review, as I already said, is just a general rundown of all the dominant class views. It's a very good article. It's a very, very good article. There was a lot of stuff to present, and I will do some of the presenting it. So I don't in some ways worry about getting all of it done, because it's like literally hundreds of different papers that they're presented here. The Hoya comes in Peter Turchin's work. So Peter Turchin, I mentioned earlier when we're talking about this sort of synthesis here. So Peter Turchin's notion is this is wealth pumps. Hoya is just the first author of that, but then Peter Turchin is the last author. Navigating Polycrisis is a really interesting paper about the ways in which people respond or societies respond to polycrisis. It's a much more compelling account than the Jared Diamond, for example. And that's why I'm bringing it up here. Luke Kemp's, I think, very radical critique of existential risk theory tries to think about how we might democratize risk, understand what it is to make it methodologically democratic. Lower Laban, security blind spot, question whether or not we want the military involved in climate change, big question mark. And then gradual disempowerment is about AI. And it's sort of a more or less an economics paper in which predicts that as AIs become more powerful, they will sort of take over more and more parts of the world, and that will be bad. So it depends on what you're interested in. Pick one of these papers if you want to. If not, there'll be other papers in the next 2 weeks you can talk about as well. Arnab?
Thank you for a great session, Richard. I just had a question. I have put it in the chat, so it would be very helpful if you could just go through it.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a question about Spengler and its relation to thermodynamics. So I think you're absolutely right. There is a connection there. They both are speaking to, and certainly this was the sort of pessimism of the late 19th century. I mentioned, I think obliquely, the degeneracy theory, right, out of which comes a bunch of racial theories about the declines of white stock. In certain states in the US, you get what's called the one drop rule, which means that if you have one drop of non-white blood, you are black, and therefore you can have awful things done to you. This is informed by the sort of the science of the day, thing called the Weissman barrier, which seems to mean that there's kind of this necessary degeneracy in society. It's all pseudoscientific. Part of it, and the much more compelling part of it, is about thermodynamics, right? It's about the ways in which there is a kind of entropic process in the universe that means that there's a finite amount of energy, finite amount of work that can be done in the terms of entropy that mean that eventually everything sort of despoils. I think that Spengler is not, he's speaking to that general sense of decline for sure. He is nevertheless a vitalist. He's a vitalist in a particular sense that he doesn't directly address thermodynamics, at least as far as I remember. He's very much a person who believes in the spiritual unity of a society, right? So his notion of the sort of the symbol of the Western world being, or Faustian culture, as he calls it, being looking off to the distant horizon, right? That is not a notion that we can, I think, interpolate into a story about thermodynamics. It's not really a notion that we can interpolate into a cosmology that goes beyond his own sort of relatively strange kind of beliefs about the world. And so there is definitely an increase in human, he thinks there is this like arc, and there definitely will be moments in which you can interpolate the thermodynamic story at certain moments in that, including increasing human freedom. And in other sense, he's a total fatalist, total determinist, totally dominated by structural features, but structural features that are not the structural features of sociology, but the structural features of a spiritual narrative, right? In that sense. Yeah, so I think you could, there are similarities there, but at the level of ontology, and I think it's good that we're coming back to this ontology question. At the level of ontology, they are utterly distinct. And I'm not sure that you could put them together.
Yes. But Richard, was he also influenced by like the esoteric systems and myths, and ancient myths and esoteric systems?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, very much influenced by like a whole range of mysticisms. Yeah. I think I'm giving you a very brief answer. I think we have to go. I don't want to make people late for what they've got to do next. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. This has been really exciting. Yeah. If anyone feels they haven't asked their question, or they have some sort of outstanding thing they want to put to me, I am on Discord. Thank you very much for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.